Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English class. Children, in my previous video, I gave you an introduction to the story The Open Window, written by H. H. Munro, also known as Saki. This story is about Mr. Frampton Nuttall, who, for his nerve cure, visits a rural area, a village, in order to enjoy some rest and peace and be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Today we are going to read section 1 of the story, and I shall explain you as to what was Mr. Frampton Nuttall's experience when he visited Mrs. Sappleton. When Mr. Nuttall visited Mrs. Sappleton, he met Mrs. Sappleton's niece, who introduced herself and tried to make Mr. Nuttall comfortable and informed that her aunt was upstairs and would come down to meet him very soon. Mr. Frampton Nuttall thought that whether it would be correct to duly flatter the niece of at the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he also doubted that during this nerve cure session he should be meeting the strangers or not. But Mr. Frampton Nuttall's sister insisted that he should be meeting some of the people in the rural areas, otherwise he will be all alone and aloof and would not be talking to even a living soul around. So, in order to do that, she gave letters of introduction to all the people she knew in the village where she was staying 3 years ago. Mr. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many people around here?" asked the niece to Mr. Frampton. Mr. Frampton replied that he knew hardly a soul. And he also told the niece of Mrs. Sappleton that my sister was staying here almost 4 years ago, and therefore she gave me a letter of introduction to some of the people living here. Then the niece informed Mr. Frampton that probably he did not know anything about her aunt. Mr. Frampton very honestly replied that he only knew her name and address. For sure, Mr. Frampton did not know anything about Mrs. Sappleton, whether she was married or widowed state. But then, when he looked around the house, he could see a lot of masculine habitation. Mrs. Sappleton's niece informed Mr. Frampton that there was a great tragedy that happened just 3 years ago. That would be since Mr. Frampton's sister's time. A tragedy? Mr. Frampton was surprised. Somehow he thought that it is unusual in such a restful country to spot tragedies. And then Mrs. Sappleton's niece said, "You may wonder why we keep the window open on an October afternoon," indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. Mr. Frampton said, "It is quite warm for the time of the year." "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" The niece of Mrs. Sappleton informed Mr. Frampton that out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and 2 young brothers went off for their shooting, and they never came back. She also said that Mrs. Sappleton's husband and brothers, while crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and the places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. She said that even their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. While saying that, the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became flatteringly human. Poor aunt, always think that they will come back someday. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at the window just as they used to, said the girl. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did, to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. And then the girl added on, "Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, she almost gets creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when Mrs. Sappleton bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. So, children, we see that Mr. Frampton is here to meet Mrs. Sappleton, but instead of meeting Mrs. Sappleton, he comes across her niece, who's giving him and telling him about the tragedy that Mrs. Sappleton had experienced almost 3 years ago. After this, what happens? We will read and understand this in our next video in section 2. Till then, thank you and have